Greetings to all. Our today's guest, Ed Steer. He was attorney in the U.S. for the first 70 years of his career. He was a prosecutor specializing in organized crime and corruption. For the past 40 years, he has investigated criminal behavior, much which was done on behalf of the U.S. Department of Justice. As a result of 60 years' experience dealing with criminals, especially members of organized crime, Mr. Steer has become an expert on the mind of the psychopath. Mr. Steer, glad to see you, and thank you for joining us.
It's good to be back.
Mr. Steer, I read a lot of comments under our interview about the psychology of a dictator, Vladimir Putin. I will quote, for example, first, "Wow, an amazingly accurate assessment of the situation. Thanks for sharing. Best analysis of a psychopath." And other comments is, "This description fits Trump perfectly as well." Second, "I would love to hear Ed Steer's assessment of Donald Trump." So today we will talk about former U.S. President Donald Trump. He is a polarizing figure in world politics. He has found himself being criticized for his actions and his statements. He has been accused of sexism, misogyny, racism, and more. So, do you agree with next comments under our interview that change Putin to Trump and this all applies? Maybe Trump and Putin should be roommates. Sounds like Trump as well as Putin know conscience, lie at the drop of a hat. Trump and Putin recognize their own type. Do you see similarities between Putin's personality and Trump's personality also?
Well, based on my experience over the last 60 years in dealing with psychopaths, my opinion is that Donald Trump is a psychopath, just as Vladimir Putin is a psychopath. There are differences between them that I can explain, but there are certain fundamental similarities that put them both in the same category.
So if we're talking about that, Republican U.S. presidential candidate Donald Trump has once again stated ahead of meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in New York on the 27th of September that he will be able to quickly end the war in case he wins the elections, and claimed he has a very good relationship with Zelensky and Russian ruler, dictator Vladimir Putin. He said it for what purpose? How do you think?
I think he is trying to convince the American public that he has some mysterious way of negotiating deals with autocrats that nobody else possesses. And the truth of it is that any deal that he would negotiate would be at the expense of the Ukrainian people. He has no particular fondness for the Ukrainian people. He has no particular sense of outrage at how the Ukrainian people have been attacked by Russia. As far as he's concerned, he can simply carve up Ukraine and give major pieces to Putin, and that would end the problem. He is trying to convey the idea to the American people that he can avoid war, potentially nuclear war, by his negotiating skills. But what he's really saying is that he will sacrifice the long-term interests of the United States and certainly the long-term interests of Ukraine and Europe as a whole in order to avoid the potential of war. It's very similar to the populist views that were held in the 1930s in the United States that prevented the United States from entering the Second World War until we were attacked by Japan at Pearl Harbor. Up until that point, populist politicians were telling the public that the war was not our war, it was being fought very far away. We have no interests. And it was basically playing to the fears of the American people about being drawn into a war. And Trump is doing exactly the same thing today.
About manipulation, U.S. presidential candidate Donald Trump has delivered a speech about the state of affairs in Ukraine, in which he manipulated facts about the war during a campaign event in North Carolina. What can you say about Donald Trump's psychological manipulation of the American people, and not only American people?
Well, assuming that my assessment of him is correct, he has no conscience. He has no capacity to tell the truth from a lie. He'll say whatever comes into his head that he thinks will play to the fears of his audience. And so there's no consistency in what he says. He'll go back and forth on both sides of an issue, depending on what he thinks will play to the audience that he's talking to. My impression of what he's trying to do with respect to Ukraine is to convince the American public that Ukraine is not worth saving, so that he can prepare the public, if he's elected, to sacrifice Ukraine in order to end the war and bring about some kind of short-term stability in Europe, of course, all for the benefit of Vladimir Putin. Let me just say one other thing about Putin and Trump, if I can, because we're making a comparison here, and I'd like to speak to the differences between them, because all psychopaths are not the same. There's a spectrum. Their range of tactics differs. The kind of risk that they're prepared to take differs from one psychopath to another. So, for example, Vladimir Putin uses murder and violence in order to manipulate the public and to eliminate his enemies. Donald Trump does not use physical violence and murder. Perhaps that may be the result of the different histories of the United States and Russia, the different political systems, but I suspect that it's deeper than that. I suspect that in Donald Trump's case, he does not have the experience or the desire to murder his enemies, but he is just as vicious toward his enemies as Vladimir Putin. And what underlies both of their personalities is the absence of any true emotion, no compassion, no conscience, no feeling of remorse, no empathy, nothing that would give them any reason to care about the people that they represent. So in that sense, Putin and Trump, in my opinion, are identical. They have no feelings for the people that they represent. In both cases, this is all about self-aggrandizement, about becoming powerful, about some kind of inner satisfaction that they feel from controlling masses of people. Their mechanisms are different in many ways, but their goals are essentially the same. Has nothing to do with protecting the interests of the Russian people or the American people. It has everything to do with the narcissism of both of these men, Putin and Trump.
Mrs. T, I know.
Let me make one other. Let me make one other comparison that I think is relevant. Something that I think is really important to understand. Both Putin and Trump have come to realize how important it is to control religious institutions in manipulating their populations. So, for example, in the case of Vladimir Putin, my understanding is that he's made a very cynical deal with the head of the Russian Orthodox Church and uses the church to control masses of people. Donald Trump has made deals with certain evangelical Christian leaders in the United States in order to control the people who adhere to those religious views, and uses those religious leaders in order to deliver his message that somehow the leadership of Donald Trump is divinely inspired. Putin does the same thing, makes it almost a religious belief that he's entitled to control the Russian Empire as he sees it. Very, very similar approaches.
So, Mr. Steer, in conclusion, as I understand, both Putin and Trump try to use religion to manipulate the public, right?
Yes. Yes. Yes, and it's clear, and the reason is because people who have deep religious convictions trust the leadership of those religious sects. And if you trust the leadership and they tell you that Vladimir Putin or Donald Trump is the rightful leader chosen by God, it makes it a lot easier to manipulate those people.
Mr. Steve, we had a conversation about Putin's childhood, and now I want to talk about Trump's childhood, because in July 2020, former President Trump's niece and clinical psychologist Mary Trump published the book Too Much and Never Enough: How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man. Mary Trump writes that Trump's mother was self-focused and absent, while his father lacked emotion and empathy. She argues that Trump had no role model for vulnerability, empathy, and reciprocity, and that displaying those traits was dangerous in the family's household. President Trump tried to win his father's approval throughout his life, which Mary Trump claims may inform the way he relates to certain world leaders today. How Trump's childhood affects him? How do you think?
Well, I've read Mary Trump's book, and I agree with very much of what she says. Now, let me explain my perspective and experience on this issue. The children of psychopaths quite often develop psychopathic traits. And the reason for that is because their parents, in Trump's case, his father, who probably had psychopathic characteristics, that is very, very shallow, if any, emotions. The parents teach their children that the only way they can receive anything that resembles love is to do exactly what they're told, to measure up to their parents' expectations. And they learn to just behave in a way that will curry favor with the parent. And whether that is enough to create a psychopath in the child, nobody is really sure. scientists simply don't know. But it certainly brings out psychopathic traits if they're there. There's no doubt about that. For example, in Donald Trump's case, his older brother, Mary Trump's father, was clearly not psychopathic. Now, he had other problems. He had alcoholic problems, which probably resulted from the way he was treated within the family. But it doesn't sound to me, from everything I know about Mary Trump's father, that he succumbed to the pressure from his father to behave in a psychopathic way. Donald Trump did. And you can see that in, for example, the fact that the two of them, the father and Donald Trump, were charged at one point by the federal government with discriminating against black tenants in a large housing development that they had built. Donald Trump and his father were clearly on the same page about how they treated African Americans at that point. And so Donald Trump learned that he needed to behave like a psychopath in order to get any kind of approval from his father. And I suspect that Donald Trump was a budding psychopath on his own. He was born that way, but certainly his experience with his father brought these characteristics out in him.
Mr. Stee, an American psychiatrist, Ben Lee, said Trump is certainly of an autocratic disposition because his extreme narcissism does not allow for equality with other human beings as democracy requires. Do you think Trump is truly exhibiting delusional or psychotic behavior, or is he simply behaving like an autocrat, making a bold-faced attempt to hold onto his power?
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't believe that Trump is psychotic. He's psychopathic, in my opinion, but he's not psychotic. There's a very important difference. Psychopath's perception of the world around him is pretty accurate, sometimes much more sensitive than a normal human being, because his understanding of what's going on around him isn't influenced by his emotions. Well, I think what the person whom you're quoting is saying is essentially the same thing that I am. That is, that Donald Trump simply does not understand democracy. He has a tendency toward autocracy because of his psychopathic characteristics. In other words, in order to support democracy, democratic institutions, you have to have a certain amount of empathy for people that are not as powerful as you are. You really have to believe that a farmer, a steel worker, a person working in McDonald's is entitled to express their view and vote on who their leadership should be. You have to believe that on an emotional level. He's not capable of understanding that on an emotional level. I mean, he is trying to manipulate the masses rather than appeal to the masses. And so as far as he's concerned, I believe that democracy in the United States is an inconvenience. And that if there's some other way he could have taken power in the United States, he would have done it. He has no respect for the United States Constitution and all of its protections against autocratic rulers. And all you need to do is to read what Donald Trump has said over the years about the Constitution and his lack of understanding of it. And what he does understand, he has no regard for. And so, and that's essentially what the prosecutions of Donald Trump are about. There are several of the prosecutions that flow from the insurrection that he fomented on January 6th. All of that is based on a complete lack of respect for the Constitution, and the fact that he's continued to lie about having won the election and the 2020 election, and having been cheated and so forth, continuing to lie and undermine the constitutional processes that exist in the United States. He can do that because he has no regard for the fundamental rights of the American public and the protections that are embedded in the Constitution. So that's what makes him autocratic. And that creates, of course, very close similarities to Vladimir Putin. I mean, look at how Vladimir Putin has undermined democracy in Russia. I mean, it flourished for a little while in Russia, but he just chipped away at it until there's nothing left. And if Donald Trump could do that in the United States, he wouldn't hesitate a minute.
Mr. Steer, I read that Trump and his defenders have suggested that some of his opponents behave in a way they characterize as Trump derangement syndrome, or TDS. They say that President Trump's actions trigger people to have distort opinions, extreme emotions, and hysterical behaviors. The same language was used previously to describe reactions to Presidents Bush and Obama. What is Trump derangement syndrome is? How do you think?
Well, all psychopaths use a device that is we refer to as false equivalence. That is, I say that you're a psychopath, you turn that around on me, and then you say, I'm not deranged, you're deranged. Then that's exactly what Trump is doing. He's saying that, for example, just in the last few days, he has publicly said that Kamala Harris is crazy. And why does he say that? I mean, Kamala Harris has shown absolutely no symptoms of any kind of psychiatric condition. But Donald Trump, of course, that doesn't stop him. He accuses her of being unbalanced. And why does he do that? It's because people are accusing him of being unbalanced, and so he turns that around and says, "Oh no! If I'm crazy, you're more crazy than I am." Have you ever seen kids in a schoolyard, children 8 years old in a schoolyard, arguing with one another? This is a typical argument. You're ugly. No, you're more ugly than I am. False equivalence.
Mrs. Steer, the traits most people value in leader, research suggests, include intelligence, diligence, humility, honesty, and compassion. Fewer people prefer a strong man leadership style that encompasses selfishness, aggression, and manipulation. Can we say that Trump has changed ideas about leadership? Do you agree that former President Trump's ability to frame himself as a populist and succeed with authoritarian traits has altered the template for leadership?
No, I don't think he's changed what it is that people want in their leaders. He has just exploited the power of a populist to divert attention away from those characteristics and to appeal to the fears that people have. In other words, you have two competing sets of criteria for leadership that can that to which the public can respond. One set of criteria has to do with intelligence, compassion, sense of direction, all of the things that you described before that people really want to see in their leaders. But there's a competing set of characteristics that can appeal to the public, and that has to do with those who understand and can exploit the fears that masses of people have. And in America, just like in Russia, people have fears. And so what we're experiencing, and we've had this happen before in America, it's not the first time we've had a Donald Trump try to gain power. What we have is a situation in which there are lots of fears that large numbers of Americans have. Some of those fears are based on real circumstances. Some of them are based on ignorance. But they're fears nonetheless, emotion-based fears, because that's what fear is. It's in your emotions. Donald Trump senses that, and everything that he says and does is designed to exploit those fears and to make people feel that he's the only candidate who can protect or relieve people from feeling those fears. Now, in Donald Trump's case, the fears that he's exploiting are, to some extent, economic fears, but I think there are other fears that are even more prevalent that he is trying to exploit, and that is fear of people who are different, fear of immigrants in this case. I mean, think about what he's been saying about Haitians, Haitian immigrants who've come to a small town in Ohio, and how he claims, falsely, lying about it, that they have been stealing the pets of people who live in that community and eating them. I mean, can you imagine anything as cruel as that? And the reason that Trump has been saying it and repeating it, in spite of the fact that everybody who's in position of authority in Ohio and in that town says none of it is true, the reason he keeps hammering away at it is because it taps into the fears of lots of people in this country of being overwhelmed by Black people, especially Black people from outside the United States. They fear that, and Trump exploits it. He doesn't try to dampen it. He doesn't try to educate people and convince people that Haitian immigrants, for the most part, are hardworking, industrious people. He does exactly the opposite. And he says these people are subhuman. I mean, this idea of diminishing the humanity of the people you're using to stimulate fears harkens back to Nazi Germany, where Hitler talked about the Jews as subhuman, the Jews as creating problems that will ultimately overwhelm and consume Germany. Donald Trump is doing exactly the same thing with respect to Haitians and other immigrants, most of whom are brown and black, and different from the people that he is trying to appeal to. And it's a terrible thing to witness. And but I am confident as an American, as somebody who has devoted my life to supporting and protecting our democratic way of life. I am convinced that the public will reject it. Abraham Lincoln said something about this over 100 years ago. He said, you can fool some of the people all of the time, and all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. And that's what I am hoping is going to happen in the election, which is 1 month away. That demagoguery, exploitation, the use of fear will be rejected by a majority of the American people, and majorities of the American people in states where the electoral votes are important to elect Kamala Harris.
Hope, but we need time. And what attracts people to Trump the most? You said that it fears. What else? What psychological factors contribute to the unwavering support for a leader who has consistently broken political norms? First, it's fears. Maybe you can say other things.
It's hard for me to put my finger on anything else that has the kind of mass appeal that fear-mongering does. I mean, Trump has put forth no realistic proposals. I mean, for example, his economic plan is to impose massive tariffs on foreign-made goods. All of the economists in the United States of any repute reject that and say that rather than achieve any economic benefits in America, it will destroy our economy. And there's a long history that supports that. So when you look at each of Donald Trump's so-called policy proposals, you see that each one is rooted in tapping into fear. There's a fear that somehow China is going to overwhelm the United States economically. There was a fear that Japan was going to do it, or South Korea was going to do it, or Europe was going to do it. Germany at one time was going to overwhelm the United States economically. It has never happened. And as a matter of fact, since the pandemic, the United States economy is doing better than any economy in the world. It's recovered much more quickly. People don't realize it. People are still suffering here from the aftermath of a period of inflation that we've experienced. There is a certain amount of dislocation that's occurred in our economy because of the changes that have occurred in our economy, from manufacturing to a service economy over several decades. there is no doubt that a lot of those fears are justified. But Donald Trump doesn't provide the answers to them. Donald Trump simply exploits them, makes them worse, and falsely leads people to believe that by taking extreme actions, which he may or may not be prepared to take, all he cares about is winning the election. He doesn't care what he has to say in order to achieve that. The effect on the public is really irrelevant to him. But these are legitimate fears that people have. I don't know what else he's doing that has any kind of mass appeal. And when you boil it down to its essence, and understand what an autocrat is about, whether it's Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin, it's all about amassing power, and there's nothing, no real element in their policies that is aimed at really solving social problems.
Mr. Steer, thank you for your interesting thoughts, for your great analysis. Our discussion have, as I said, purpose. It can serve to develop a better understanding of the statements, actions, and policies of a man who is often characterized as erratic and unpredictable. Guys, subscribe on our YouTube channel, like this video, and see you.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.